In the autumn of 1886, in the vast windswept expanse of Pembina County, Dakota Territory, the air carried the sharp scent of curing wood and the rhythmic thud of axes. It was a season of preparation, a frantic race against the inevitable descent of a winter that promised not just cold, but a deep and lethal hostility. The settlers, mostly hardy folk from the flatter, more forgiving lands of Ohio and Illinois, understood this race in simple, direct terms. Seal the walls, stack the wood. Along the crooked line of the Tongue River, cabin after cabin received its final winter armor. Men and boys wedged moss and mud into the gaps between logs, a process they called chinking. Their work was a testament to a philosophy of brute force. A good wall was a thick wall. A warm house was one fed by a mountain of firewood. But one cabin stood apart, an object of growing curiosity and ridicule. It belonged to Anders Larsen, a Norwegian immigrant who had arrived 2 years prior. While his neighbors reinforced their single, solid walls, Anders was engaged in a project that defied all local logic. He was building a second wall, a thin, almost flimsy-looking structure that encircled his entire cabin. It was made of cheap cottonwood planks, nailed vertically to a simple frame. This outer shell stood a deliberate 18 inches from the sturdy log walls of his actual home, creating a narrow, circumambient corridor open to the sky. He did not chink this outer wall. In fact, he left small, deliberate gaps between the planks. It looked less like a fortification and more like a tall, poorly made fence. The commentary from his neighbors was constant and unflattering. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. Hiram Calloway, a man whose own cabin was a point of local pride for its thick oak logs and immaculate chinking, was the most vocal critic. "He's building a fence to keep the squirrels warm," Calloway announced one afternoon to a group of men gathered at the small trading post. The laughter was easy and loud. The project earned a name: Larsen's Folly. Children would run past, pointing and shouting, "There's the man who builds his house twice!" To the established community, Larsen's work was an affront to common sense, a squandering of precious time and lumber on a structure that offered no conceivable benefit. It was unnatural. A house was a single, solid thing, a fortress against the elements. This strange, layered contraption was a whim, the folly of a foreigner who did not understand the brutal realities of a Dakota winter. That winter, and more catastrophically the next, the prairie would unleash a fury that would be etched into the memory of the region for a century. The Great Blizzard of 1887, followed by the even more infamous Schoolhouse Blizzard of 1888, were not mere storms. They were meteorological monsters that descended with shocking speed and unimaginable power. Temperatures plummeted tens of degrees in minutes, and winds of hurricane force drove snow so fine and dense it was like a solid white wall moving across the plains. In the aftermath, the landscape would be littered with the frozen carcasses of cattle and, tragically, the bodies of settlers caught unprepared. The standard single-walled cabins that represented the height of frontier common sense would become frigid tombs, their owners burning furniture to stay alive. But through it all, one cabin would remain an island of quiet, steady warmth, its owner consuming a fraction of the firewood his desperate neighbors burned. The strange, flimsy outer wall, the object of so much scorn, would perform a miracle of physics that no one had anticipated. What did this quiet Norwegian understand about thermal dynamics, about the profound insulating power of stillness, that everyone else, in their noisy confidence, dismissed as foolish? What secret was held in that strange 18-inch gap between the walls of his cabin? A secret born not in a laboratory, but in the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 frozen winters in a distant land. Anders Larsen hailed from the high, cold plateaus surrounding Røros, a copper mining town in central Norway tucked into a landscape of unforgiving winters. There, the cold was not a seasonal visitor, it was the permanent landlord of the region. Survival was a science passed down through generations, a set of unwritten laws etched into the very design of their buildings and the rhythm of their lives. Anders had grown up in a farmhouse built by his great-grandfather, a structure that had evolved over a century of observation. He remembered the stabber, the traditional storehouse raised on pillars. Its walls were double-planked, not for strength, but for preservation. His grandfather, a man of few words but deep practical knowledge, had once explained it to him as a boy. He had knocked on the outer wall, then the inner wall. "The cold kills the outside," he had said in his native tongue, "but the air between them is the real wall. It is a blanket of nothing." This concept, the blanket of nothing, had lodged itself deep in Anders' mind. He had seen its power everywhere. He watched how the deep, settled snow, far from being a threat, was a blessing. When it piled high against the stone foundations and lower walls of the house, the inside became noticeably warmer. The snow itself, being mostly trapped air, was an insulator. The wind could howl over its surface, but the house felt only the stillness of the snowbank. He saw it in the way shepherds built emergency shelters, digging into a deep drift and hollowing out a cave. The wind could be a blizzard of razor blades just feet away, but inside the snow cave, the temperature would hold steadily around freezing, a life-saving difference from the deadly, sub-zero air outside. It was always about defeating the wind and trapping the air. When Anders immigrated to America, he carried this ingrained knowledge with him. His journey took him first to the bustling ports of the Great Lakes, where he found work for a season with a crew cutting ice from Lake Michigan. The job was brutal, but the ice houses were a revelation. These vast wooden barns, built to store thousands of tons of ice through the heat of summer, were constructed on the same principle as his grandfather's stabber, but on a colossal scale. They were double-walled structures, and the wide gap between the inner and outer walls, sometimes as much as 3 feet, was packed tightly with sawdust. In the sweltering humidity of a Chicago July, Anders had stood inside an ice house and felt the deep, penetrating cold radiating from the massive blocks of ice. The sawdust wasn't strong, it was just filler, but its purpose was singular and critical: to trap millions of tiny pockets of air, creating a thick, impassable barrier to heat. The sawdust prevented the air from moving, from forming the convection currents that would have rapidly transferred the summer heat to the ice. It was another blanket of nothing, made tangible. His final piece of insight came not from his past, but from his new home. In his first year in the Dakota Territory, while scouting for timber along a frozen creek, he had come across a winter camp of the Ojibwe people. He had been invited to share a meal, an act of grace he never forgot. He sat inside a wigwam, a lodge constructed of a frame of bent saplings covered in layers of birch bark and woven cattail mats. A small fire burned in the center, and despite the bitter wind outside, the interior was remarkably comfortable. He noticed the construction was not a single thick layer, but multiple overlapping layers. He later had a chance to speak with an elder named Chaitin, a man whose eyes held the patience of the landscape itself. Through a mix of gestures and the few words of English Chaitin knew, Anders asked how such a seemingly delicate structure could be so warm. Chaitin had smiled. He picked up 2 pieces of bark and held them pressed together. Then he held them slightly apart. He blew on the first pair, and Anders could feel the breath on his hand behind them. Then he blew on the second, separated pair. The breath was greatly diminished. Chaitin then spoke a simple, profound sentence that crystallized everything Anders had ever learned. "Wind is the thief," he said, tapping the outer piece of bark. "Stillness is the blanket," he added, indicating the space between them. In that moment, all the pieces clicked into place. His grandfather's wisdom, the design of the ice houses, the efficiency of the wigwam. They were all expressions of the same fundamental truth. The greatest enemy in a cold climate was not the low temperature itself, but the movement of air, which stole heat with ruthless efficiency. The solution was not just to build a thick wall, but to create a zone of calm, a layer of trapped, dead air that would act as a buffer between the warmth of the inside and the frozen, moving chaos of the outside. This principle, which modern science would later quantify with terms like thermal convection, conduction, and R values, was understood by Anders in a purely practical, intuitive way. He knew that heat moved in 3 ways. It conducted through solids. A log wall, no matter how thick, would always bleed heat to the colder outside. It radiated away from warm surfaces into the cold, but most aggressively, it was carried away by convection, by the physical movement of air. A draft, the bane of every frontier cabin, was a convection current, a river of cold air displacing the warm. The wind scouring the outside of a cabin was a massive convection engine, constantly stripping away heat. His double wall was designed to defeat this primary enemy. The outer wall would stop the wind, the thief. The 18 inches of air inside would become the blanket of stillness. The construction of Larson's Folly began in late September. It was a study in methodical patience, a stark contrast to the hurried, almost panicked pace of his neighbors. Anders did not use his prime oak or ash logs for the project. Instead, he used what others considered secondary materials: slender cottonwood poles for the uprights and rough-sawn, 1-inch thick cottonwood planks for the sheathing. This choice of material only added to the community's derision. Calloway, passing by one morning, scoffed audibly. "Using firewood to build a wall? The man's gone mad." But Anders' choice was deliberate. The outer wall didn't need to be strong. It only needed to be a screen. Its purpose was not structural integrity, but wind breaking. Using cheaper wood meant he could save his valuable, dense hardwood for the fire that would burn inside. His process was meticulous. First, he laid a simple foundation of flat fieldstones, creating a level ring 18 inches out from the existing foundation of his cabin. Into this, he set the cottonwood posts, one at each corner and 2 more spaced along the longer walls of his small rectangular home. He didn't dig deep post holes. He simply braced them against the stone footing and then ran simple ledger boards from the posts to anchor points he had bolted into the main log walls of his cabin. This created a rigid, self-supporting frame that looked like a skeletal echo of the house it surrounded. The sight of this spindly cage drew a fresh round of jokes at the trading post about Larson building a corn crib around his house. Next came the planks. He nailed them vertically to the frame, starting from the bottom and working his way up. He was not careful about making them airtight. On the contrary, he left a deliberate gap of about 1/4 inch between each board. This was, to his neighbors, the ultimate proof of his insanity. Hiram Calloway, unable to contain his disbelief, strode over one afternoon while Anders was working. "Larson," he said, his voice laced with condescending authority, "the wind will go through that wall like water through a sieve. You're supposed to keep the drafts out, not invite them in." Anders paused his hammering, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, and looked at Calloway. He didn't offer a complex defense. He simply pointed to the outer planks. "This wall is for the wind," he said calmly. Then he pointed to the thick log wall of his actual cabin. "That wall is for the cold." This gnomic utterance only confused and irritated Calloway further. "That makes no sense at all," he muttered as he walked away, shaking his head. The final and perhaps most peculiar element of the design was the roof. Anders didn't build a separate roof for his new wall. Instead, he had his friend, a blacksmith with a talent for carpentry, help him extend the existing roofline of his cabin. They carefully spliced new rafters onto the old ones, carrying the gentle slope of the roof out and over the new wall. The result was a low, covered gallery, like a cloister, that ran around the entire perimeter of his home. This feature, too, was mocked as a waste of good shingles, a shaded porch for a man who would soon be too cold to sit outside. But for Anders, it was a critical part of the system. This protected walkway would be his woodshed, a place to stack a winter supply of fuel, keeping it perfectly dry and just a few steps from his door, no matter how deep the snow drifted. Hiram Calloway represented the pinnacle of local conventional wisdom. His cabin was a fortress, built from the largest, straightest oak logs he could find. He had spent an entire summer with his sons painstakingly packing every seam with a mixture of clay and dried grass, until the walls were, in his words, as tight as a drum. He had built a massive fieldstone fireplace, with a chimney that soared above the roofline, a proud monument to his prosperity. Inside, he had insisted on a high ceiling, nearly 10 feet, because he felt it gave the room a sense of dignity and space, unlike the low, almost claustrophobic ceilings of the Scandinavian immigrants. He believed in fighting the Dakota winter with overwhelming force. If the cabin was cold, you built a bigger fire. If the fire consumed too much wood, You spent more time cutting and stacking it. The problem was one of supply, not design. He saw Anders Larsen's project not just as foolish, but as a kind of passive, weak-willed approach to the challenges of the frontier. It seemed flimsy, indirect, and complicated. "A man faces the winter head-on," Calloway declared to his wife Mary. "He doesn't build hiding places for the wind." Mary, a practical woman, was less certain. She had seen the quiet, unshakable confidence with which the Norwegian worked. He never seemed rushed or worried. He would pause, consult a small, dog-eared notebook filled with sketches and calculations, and then resume his work. There was a purpose in his movements that transcended the simple act of construction. It looked like he was solving a puzzle, not just building a wall. Anders, for his part, was largely oblivious to the social drama he was creating. His mind was occupied with the principles he was putting into practice. He knew the quarter-inch gaps in his outer wall were important. A perfectly sealed outer wall would create pressure differentials in high winds that could tear the planks loose. These small gaps would allow air pressure to equalize, letting the wind's force dissipate, while still shattering its coherent, heat-stealing velocity. The air inside the cavity would be disturbed, but it would not flow in a steady, heat-sapping current. It would be chaotic and turbulent, but its net movement would be close to zero. It would be, for all practical purposes, still. He had made his calculations. The amount of lumber he used for his folly was less than the extra cord of wood Calloway would have to chop and haul to maintain a comparable temperature in his inefficient fortress. Anders wasn't wasting resources. He was investing them in a system that would pay dividends in warmth, labor, and security all winter long. He worked on the steady tap, tap, tap of his hammer, a quiet counterpoint to the rising winds of late autumn and the loud, confident laughter of his neighbors. The winter began with a deceptive mildness, a false spring in early January of 1887 that lulled the territory into a dangerous complacency. The sun shone, the snow melted, and farmers let their cattle roam farther than usual. Then, on the evening of January 9th, the sky turned a strange, sickly yellow-gray. The temperature, which had been a pleasant 35 degrees Fahrenheit, began to drop with an unnatural speed. An eerie silence fell over the plains, a silence that was soon shattered by a low, guttural roar from the northwest. It was the sound of an Arctic air mass, a solid wall of cold crashing down from Canada. The great blizzard had arrived. Within an hour, the temperature had plunged 50 degrees. The wind exploded from a breeze into a shrieking 60-mile-per-hour gale. The snow it carried was not made of flakes, but of fine, hard ice crystals that scoured the landscape like sand. Visibility dropped to zero. The world beyond one's cabin walls ceased to exist, replaced by a screaming white void. It was a storm of breathtaking violence, a sudden and total assault by the elements. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, the test of their brute force philosophy had begun, and they were failing. Inside Hiram Calloway's proud oak fortress, the reality of his miscalculation was setting in with a terrifying chill. The wind did not just blow against his cabin, it attacked it. It found every microscopic fissure in his perfect chinking, every tiny gap around the window frames, and turned them into whistling conduits of Arctic air. Fine, powder-like snow was driven through these cracks, accumulating in ghostly white lines on the floor. The mighty log walls, so impressive in the autumn sun, had become massive conductors of cold. They radiated a deep, penetrating chill that no fire seemed able to conquer. The very substance of his fortress was betraying him, leaching the precious heat out into the storm. His greatest pride, the high ceiling, had become his greatest liability. The laws of physics, which he had ignored, were now asserting their dominance. The warm air from his roaring fire rose uselessly to the 10-foot ceiling, pooling in a stagnant, unreachable layer, while the air at floor level, where his family lived, remained brutally cold. His infant daughter Sarah, bundled in every blanket they owned, was still shivering in her cradle. The floor was a sheet of ice-cold drafts. Smoke began to puff back down the chimney, the incredible wind creating bizarre pressure dynamics that fought the flue's draw. the room filled with an acrid haze that made their eyes water and their throats burn. By midnight, the most terrifying realization dawned on him. His woodpile, a massive stack he had boasted about, was 50 feet from the cabin door, now buried under a mountain of impacted snow that was as hard as concrete. The wood he had in the bin by the fire was dwindling at an alarming rate. He was a king in a castle of cold, burning through his treasure with nothing to show for it. Less than a mile away, the atmosphere inside Anders Larsen's cabin was from another world. Outside, the same hurricane-force wind shrieked and howled, but its primary force was spent on the thin, sacrificial wall of cottonwood. The planks vibrated and groaned, but they held, breaking the wind's momentum and turning its focused assault into diffused, chaotic turbulence. In the 18-inch gap, the blanket of nothing, a remarkable transformation was occurring. The air was cold, yes, but it was relatively still. More importantly, the fine, driving snow that was plaguing Callaway was pouring through the gaps in the outer wall and settling into the cavity. It didn't blow away, it was trapped. Hour by hour, the space between the walls filled with a deep, light powder. The snow, a substance that is 90% trapped air, was forming a perfect, seamless layer of insulation around the entire cabin. Anders was not just protected by a wall of air, he was now being buried in a massive, self-sealing cocoon of nature's own design. Inside, the effect was profound. It was quiet. The deafening roar of the storm was muffled to a distant, ignorable hum. The inner log walls of his cabin were not radiating cold. They were cool, but not frigid to the touch. The dead air and the accumulating snow had created such an effective thermal break that the brutal minus 30-degree temperature outside was barely affecting the inner structure. His small, efficient cast-iron stove burned with a steady, calm flame, its draw untroubled by the storm. The low 7-foot ceiling kept the radiant heat concentrated in the living space, creating a zone of consistent, comfortable warmth. His entire winter's supply of firewood was stacked neatly in the covered gallery, bone-dry and accessible, just 3 steps from his door. He had created not a fortress to fight the winter, but a system that co-opted the winter's own weapons, the snow, and used them against it. He was not winning by force. He was surviving through intelligence. Through the first day of the blizzard, Anders remained calm, a scientist observing his experiment. He was not merely enjoying the warmth, he was measuring it. Every few hours he would check a small brass thermometer that hung on an inner wall, far from the stove. It held steady at 62 degrees Fahrenheit, an almost unbelievable temperature under the circumstances. He consulted his ledger, a habit of meticulous record-keeping. He noted the time and the number of logs he added to the stove. His calculations showed he was using less than a third of the wood he would have needed on a normal winter's night. And this was no normal night. To test for drafts, he would occasionally light a thin sliver of pine, a spill, and hold the smoking taper near the edges of the single window and the door. The thin ribbon of smoke rose almost perfectly vertically, barely wavering. There were no drafts. His living space was a pocket of serene, warm stillness, sealed away from the kinetic fury outside. By the morning of the second day, the situation at the Callaway cabin had devolved from desperate to critical. They had burned through all the wood in the house. In a state of near panic, Hiram had taken an axe to a wooden bench, chopping it into pieces to feed the ravenous, inefficient fire. The smoke in the room was now so thick it was hard to breathe. The baby, Sarah, had developed a harsh, rattling cough, and Mary's face was a mask of fear. The temperature inside the cabin, despite the fire, had dropped below freezing. Frost was forming on the blankets. Hiram knew he had been defeated. His pride, his confidence, his entire philosophy of frontier survival had been shattered by the relentless physics of the storm. There was only one option, a humiliating but necessary pilgrimage. He had to get to Larsen's. Bundling himself in every layer he owned, he tied a rope around his waist, giving the other end to Mary. He would try to follow the faint line of a fence, hoping it would lead him toward the Norwegian's cabin. He stepped out the door and was immediately knocked to his knees by the force of the wind. The world was a blinding, suffocating chaos. He could not see his own feet. He crawled, feeling for the fence posts, the ice crystals sandblasting his exposed skin. The journey of less than a mile took him nearly an hour, a terrifying, disorienting ordeal. He nearly missed the cabin entirely, a dark shape that loomed up suddenly in the whiteout. He saw a faint, warm glow from its single window, a beacon of impossible tranquility. He stumbled onto the covered gallery, suddenly out of the wind, and hammered on the door with his frozen fists. The door swung open, and Hiram Calloway fell inside, collapsing onto the floor. The first thing that struck him was not the man standing over him, but the feeling. It was a wave of steady, enveloping, silent warmth. There was no smoke in the air, no howling draft. He pushed himself up and stared. He saw the small, placid fire in the stove, burning with an almost lazy efficiency. He saw Anders Larsen, looking at him not with triumph, but with simple, calm concern. Calloway's pride was a bitter taste in his mouth, but survival was a more powerful instinct. He looked around the small, warm room, at the placidly rising smoke from the test spill Anders had just lit, at the thermometer on the wall. He finally looked at Anders, and the apology he thought he should make died on his lips. It felt inadequate. Instead, a question born of pure, humbled curiosity emerged. "The snow," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "It fills the gap? The wind doesn't blow it out?" Anders simply nodded, helping the half-frozen man to a chair near the stove. "The outer wall slows the wind," he explained, his voice even and uninflected. "The snow is too heavy to be disturbed. It helps, but the still air is the real work. It was warm before the snow came." Calloway sat there, dripping melted snow onto the clean-scrubbed floorboards, absorbing the profound lesson. He had tried to shout down the winter, and had been silenced. Anders had listened to the winter, understood its language of wind and stillness, and had been rewarded with peace. There was no hint of, "I told you so," in Anders Larsen's demeanor. His vindication was not in words, but in the life-sustaining warmth of his home. He acted with an immediate and simple grace. He fetched a cup of hot, strong coffee for Hiram, then helped him to his feet. "Your family," Anders said. It was a statement, not a question. Together they tethered themselves to the rope and made the perilous journey back to the Calloway cabin. They brought Mary and the feverish baby back to the haven of warmth. Anders gave them his own bed, stoked the fire with a few pieces of his plentiful dry wood, and settled into a chair for the night, watching over the family of the man who had led the chorus of mockery against him. His victory was not in being right. It was in being prepared, and in the quiet generosity that preparation afforded him. When the blizzard finally broke on the third day, the sun rose on a world transformed, a landscape of sculpted alien beauty and profound danger. The story of the Callaways' rescue spread through the small community as survivors emerged to check on one another. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Families in standard cabins told stories of huddling together for warmth, of burning precious possessions, of relentless, soul-crushing cold. And then there was the story of the Larsen cabin, an island of summer in the heart of the Arctic tempest. Calloway, humbled and converted, became the innovation's most fervent advocate. He did not speak of his own foolishness, but of Anders' wisdom. He explained the principle to his neighbors, using the Norwegian's own simple, powerful words. "He built a blanket of air," Calloway would say, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "The outer wall takes the punch of the wind, and the air inside just sits still. The cold can't cross it." That summer, a new kind of construction began in Pembina County. One by one, families came to Anders Larsen, not with jokes, but with notebooks and questions. He never lectured. Callaway, with the zeal of a convert, built the most impressive replica of all, a perfectly measured and executed Larson Wall around his oak fortress, his monument to a hard-learned lesson. By the time the first snows of the next winter threatened, nearly a half-dozen cabins in the area were wrapped in their new air blankets. The results were immediate and dramatic. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was another brutal one, culminating in the legendary schoolhouse blizzard of January 1888, a storm that killed hundreds across the plains, many of them children caught walking home from school. But in the small cluster of air-wrapped cabins in Pembina County, the stories were different. Fuel consumption plummeted. Families who had once burned through 4 or 5 cords of wood now found that 2 were more than sufficient. The local doctor, a pragmatic man who traveled by sleigh, noted a marked decrease in cases of pneumonia and frostbite among the families who had adopted the new design. The infants born that year thrived, and the elderly survived. The double wall was no longer Larson's folly. It became known as the Dakota Wrap, a local innovation, a badge of practical wisdom that separated the prepared from the merely hopeful. The idea did not remain confined to Pembina County. The local schoolteacher, a Miss Eleanor Vance, who had watched the entire saga unfold with fascination, was an amateur correspondent for a regional agricultural journal called The Dakota Farmer. In the spring of 1888, she wrote a detailed article about the events of the previous 2 winters. She did not frame it as a story of personal drama, but as a practical guide for her fellow frontier settlers. She titled it, "The Principle of the Still Air, a Lesson in Winter Survival." She included sketches based on Anders' own drawings and provided testimonials from Hiram Callaway and others, complete with data on their reduced firewood consumption. The article was widely reprinted, and the simple, low-cost idea of an uninsulated, wind-breaking outer wall spread across the northern plains, a quiet revolution in frontier architecture that undoubtedly saved countless lives. Looking back with the lens of modern building science, what Anders Larson created was astonishingly prescient. He had, with no formal training, built a highly effective rain screen and a super-insulated wall assembly. The outer wall served as the weather barrier, deflecting wind and precipitation. The air cavity acted as a capillary break and a pressure equalization chamber, preventing moisture from being driven into the main log structure. This is the fundamental principle behind the most advanced building envelopes today. When that cavity filled with snow, he was benefiting from the impressive insulating properties that modern science quantifies as an R value. Dry, uncompacted snow has an R value of up to R1 per inch. A deep 3-foot drift packed into his 18-inch cavity could create an insulating blanket of R20 or more, added to the R value of the logs and the still air itself. His low ceilings were a masterstroke of efficiency, concentrating the radiant heat from the stove in the occupied zone and reducing the total volume of air that needed to be heated. A concept now central to passive house design and energy efficiency, often termed conditioning the living volume. Ultimately, the story of Larson's folly was more than a tale of clever construction. It was a parable about 2 fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. One philosophy, represented by Hiram Callaway and the community, was born of an aggressive impulse to conquer and subdue the environment. It relied on brute force, on overpowering nature with bigger fires and thicker walls. It was a philosophy of loud confidence that mistook stubbornness for strength. The other, embodied by Anders Larson, was born of quiet observation, humility, and a deep generational respect for the forces of nature. It did not seek to fight the winter, but to understand its physics and redirect its power. It was a victory for practical wisdom over conventional folly, for preparation over panic, for the elegant, powerful solution that is so often missed by those in a hurry. In the unforgiving arithmetic of the prairie, where the difference between life and death could be measured in degrees of temperature or stacks of firewood, survival was not awarded to the strongest arm or the loudest voice. It was granted to the quiet mind that understood the profound, life-giving power of a simple, captured breath.